Okay, everything's being recorded, so anything you say can and will be used against you somehow. All right. Welcome to the Clatsop County Coordinated Comprehensive Housing Task Force.
Cannon Beach and Friends.
Cannon Beach and Friends Housing. Yes, because this whole thing started with Cannon Beach and has spread, not like a virus. All right, so we are glad to be here. My name is Jay Blake. I am kind of the MC, the co-host, if you will. And we're going to walk our way through a fairly short agenda in terms of the number of items, but one of those items might take a little bit of time, as I understand. So the Regional Housing Task Force has been active for a couple of years now. We are in the middle of working on countywide data collection relative to housing strategies, et cetera, that may be developed over time. Let's start with introductions. Why don't you, we're gonna start here with my good friend from Cannon Beach.
Hello, Robert St. Clair, planner, Cannon Beach.
I'm Jay Blake. I'm the planning manager for Clatsop County.
Tim Ritz, North Coast Housing Solutions.
Steve Sokolowski from the Cannon Beach Planning Department.
Barb Knopf, Mayor of Cannon Beach.
Matthew Ellis, Planning Director for the City of Warrenton.
I'm not from Cannon Beach.
But you're a friend, Cannon Beach and Friends.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm Rita Fackrell, Gearhart City Councilor.
All right,
Steve Wright, Seaside Mayor.
all right, we're gonna go to the back.
Tom Brownson, Astoria City Council.
All right,
Kelsey Valency for Northwest Natural.
all right,
John Twayoka, Clatsop County Commissioner.
all right,
Denise Loffman, I'm the director with Crest.
I'm Paul Lindbergh, I'm a grant writer.
all right.
Melissa Gertler, Clatsop County Housing Manager.
And Jess Lacio, City of Warrenton City Commissioner. That's right?
That is
Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
Congratulations.
My first meeting was last night, so I'm still fresh. I was previously on the planning commission, so that's what I'm familiar with. But I'm also redeveloping the old Clinton grocery building, putting some affordable housing units upstairs in the residential and then revamping the commercial. So, you know, coming at this from both sides, both private and public.
All right, great. We had a newcomer
Jared Karnofsky, Vice President of Ancillary and Support Services from Columbia Memorial Hospital.
and someone who likes the Stone Temple Pilots.
Oh, yes.
All right. I did. All right. And let's go online. Who do we have? Gail, go ahead and start.
Hi, Gail Henriksen, Clatsop County Community Development.
All right. Sean.
Hi, folks. Sean Edging, housing planner at DLCD.
All right, great to have you here. Colin?
Good afternoon, everyone. Colin Cooper, Columbia Pacific Economic Development District.
Matt?
Hello, everyone. Matt Brandmeier, Astoria Community Development Director.
Garrett?
Hi, this is Garrett Phillips with the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force.
And Amanda?
Amanda Raffenchuk, Clatsop County Management Policy Analyst.
All right, welcome everyone. I appreciate your time this afternoon. We have really two items on our agenda for this afternoon. One is the ONA, Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and Sean is going to give us a little bit of a presentation on that.
Give an intro to Sean.
Oh, you can. Oh, absolutely. You
Yes.
can. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'll pass that one off. And then we will have a presentation on collaboration and some opportunities that Providence Health has put forward with Paul from across the table from me. So please go ahead, introduce our guest.
I'll probably want to introduce him too.
You will.
At the time.
Yeah.
So we have been talking for a while about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It comes out of state legislation that basically changes the way Oregon plans for housing in communities, changes state land use law to update state land use goal 10 around housing to now focus on housing needs and production. And we've had multiple conversations along the way with Department of Land Conservation and Development about how they're going about it. I sit on the rulemaking advisory committee and I've tried to keep you guys updated. I've invited Sean from DLCD to come and give an update. They have a report that is now out for public comment for the next month, and it is about the methodology that they are using to implement the housing needs analysis. Ultimately, that will result in cities over 10,000, I'm pointing at Astoria, of course, having to do a housing capacity analysis and production strategy to meet the target that is assigned to them in terms of needs for housing units. I think we're all interested, particularly in the updated methodology that now includes vacation homes and short-term rentals as part of the methodology, as well as counting around homeless individuals. So wanted you guys to get the presentation straight from the horse's mouth. Sean, I did not mean to call you a horse, but basically from the state, talking about the methodology, the process they've used. And then I think we might want to talk amongst ourselves about how we might want to engage in the DLCD public comment, whether we want to submit them individually from jurisdictions, or if we want to do it as a group, or if we want to weigh in, or if we just think it's super great and we just want to thank DLCD for their hard work and get to work at building the thousands of housing units that are probably going to be allocated to us. So I just wanted to put it into context of why we want to have this conversation now. And Sean is one of the most knowledgeable people I know about the state housing needs analysis. So Sean, thank you for coming to the meeting and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, of course. And maybe just a clarifying question. So, I think I prepared this presentation as like a kind of broad overview of the Oregon housing needs analysis. So the total policy, I did not really focus that much on like describing the methodology. Like I speak to it, there's a method, an interim methodology that's published. There's actually a full webinar kind of going into the like nerdy details of like how they estimate need, all that kind of stuff. But is that something you want me to try to spend more time on? I should caution because I'm not like the methodological expert here. Really, Das is leading that conversation. I'll talk about that too as we get into the presentation. But is that something you guys want to focus on?
Well, as you can tell, we have a mix of practitioners, policymakers, public-private partners. So probably you don't have to get too nerdy. But I think, putting it in context of the larger ONA conversation that you're going to talk about. And so I think probably what you have in mind is right for this audience, but some of the nerds may have questions.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I'll do my best. Again, I'll just kind of caution, right? Like definitely not an economist. So as we kind of dive into it, there might be times where I'm just kind of like, yeah, read the report or, check out this webinar, things like that. But just so you guys have that expectation going into it. But with that, okay, well then I'll share my screen. So I should mention, I do have a hard stop at 2. So I did try to design this presentation to fit within the hour. It's kind of divided more or less into 3 parts. The first part is just supposed to be like kind of a broad intro. Like if you've never heard of the policy before, you don't know really what's part of it, essentially what is in it, what does it do, that type of thing, and what are the kind of different components that we're working on actively for implementation. The second piece is, how does this affect kind of local planning, especially as it relates to Clatsop County? I think Alyssa pointed out, right, that the requirement for regular Goal 10 planning falls to cities above 10,000, but there's kind of these heightened expectations for, coordination at different levels of government that I think a lot of different cities can take advantage of, including smaller cities, as well as, regional entities such as Clatsop County, that type of thing. And then the last part is really just kind of like a process update. Like, we just published, for example, a first draft of rules. We know it's going to need a lot more refinement. There was an interim version of the methodology that was published that's out for public comment. I believe the comments are due August 16th. I'll, kind of provide, there's links and all that kind of stuff and, places that I can point you to where you can provide feedback on different things. So that's how I've divided it. I also have an optional section that we probably won't get to because I wasn't sure if you guys wanted to talk about 2024 bills. These are not ONA bills, but like things that the legislature is considering or actually passed that relate to things like funding and statewide coordination. But I won't talk about those just in recognition of time and the scope and intent of this meeting. So with that, let's dive into it. All right, so I'm going to start by going into just like a very basic, all right, what is the Oregon housing needs analysis and what does this policy do? For those who are not familiar, I know you guys have talked about this already. It was a bill that was passed in the 2023 legislative session under the bill name House Bill 2001. And in short, what it's kind of responding to is on the statewide approach that we have for planning for housing in the state of Oregon. And that really gets down into how we implement statewide land use planning goal 10. Again, for those who might not be familiar with the statewide land use planning program, it's a program that we've had on the books since the 1970s. It consists of 19 goals, all of which touch on different kind of topics, some of which are kind of rural goals like, agriculture or forest lands or natural resources, some of which are more urban goals like transportation, economic development, and of course, housing, right? And so that's goal 10. I have an excerpt of the text language above here, but essentially what it articulates is that, local governments and obviously the state in partnership have kind of a responsibility to plan for and encourage the development of housing, a variety of housing options, a variety of affordabilities, and also to plan for, kind of choice, to plan for choices in location, choices in the type of housing that you live in, that type of thing. And the basic premise behind this is that, we kind of shorthand this to be planning for housing production, affordability, and choice. Those are kind of the three words that we rely on oftentimes to summarize this responsibility for Goal 10. Now, what I have in front of you, this kind of simplified graphic here, is intended to show what the historic Goal 10 process looked like pre-Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And really, what I should emphasize is that the way that Goal 10 was implemented was almost entirely focused on just how much land we had available within urban growth boundaries to support the production of housing. So really what it was kind of like a nerdy accounting exercise, especially if you look at the parts in the left here in blue. What a local government's kind of primary responsibility was to, they had a population projection. They would project the amount of housing that they would expect to see over the next 20 years. They would inventory all of the lands that existed inside of their urban growth boundaries, and they would kind of do a big math equation based on how much we expect to grow and how much land capacity we have. Do we have enough land to accommodate 20 years of projected growth, right? And if you didn't, you had to do something about it under state law. And there are pretty much two options. You can grow in or up, so like infill, and or you can grow out. You can expand the UGB. Then you get into goal 14, which is all related to urbanization. There's a whole process that goes into there. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with that. But the basic premise, it was just how much land do you have? Right. And I think one of the things that we kind of recognize, all of us recognize, given, our various expertises, is the amount of land that you have inside of an urban growth boundary and the zoning or the zone capacity of it. That's an important part of the housing equation, but it's not the only part, right? That's not going to make housing get developed. That's not going to serve the land with infrastructure. That's not going to make sure that you have processes in place that support production. It's not going to address barriers to production. It's not going to address funding gaps or financing gaps, all of those different types of things. And so one of the kind of initial changes that happened before the ONA was in 2019. They added on this green section here on the right, and that's a housing production strategy. So everything on the left, housing capacity analysis focused on how much land's in the UGB. This part on the right, housing production strategy. And the best way to think about this is a requirement for cities above 10,000 to articulate what they're going to do over the next 8 years or 6 years inside the metro to promote the development of housing, right? So this is a much broader range of tools and actions. It can include regulatory changes, it can include financial policies, TIF, things like TIF districts or zoning changes or regulatory changes that are really intended to promote the development of needed housing, kind of recognizing, right, that it's not just about land capacity, it's also about what actions we take to promote development, right? And so this, again, is the historic focus of it, really primarily a land exercise equation. So what the legislature did in 2019 is they directed DLCD, hey, look into goal 10. What our goals are is facilitating actual production outcomes. We care about achieving production, affordability, and choice. And so, we kind of went through this entire process. I'm sure I've actually even talked to some of you guys in this room about some of the provisions that we included in that report, though I talked to a lot of folks, so I don't know precisely. But essentially, we developed a series of legislative recommendations for consideration that essentially resulted in the passage of House Bill 2001 2020 in the 2023 legislative session, where they implemented some, but not all, of the recommendations in the legislative report. What I have here in kind of the red boxes are the parts of the recommendations that were implemented. Pretty much the best way to summarize it is what the legislature moved forward with in House Bill 2001 were all the components related to the implementation of Goal 10. So, around housing capacity analyses, around housing production strategies, and really kind of setting up a comprehensive system that seeks to actually achieve outcomes. What they didn't do, but is not being ignored by the legislature, is they didn't do these kind of recommendations about the state side of things. We know that in order to achieve production, affordability, and choice, we need the state to step up with funding housing that the market wouldn't otherwise produce through things like investments in infrastructure, investments in affordable housing, things like that. And then we also need a broader statewide coordination around housing production, right? Now, both of these topics, these are huge, and the legislature and the governor's office, they've all been thinking about them. There are different policy ideas that are starting to get at these concepts. I'm sure you guys have seen some of the articles around, different investments that the legislature is making in 2024, and they will be making in 2025. All of that's still ongoing, but this bill does not contain those things, right? So with that in mind, what does the bill contain? And there's really kind of a couple of, I'll talk through kind of the individual components, but if we think back to that, maybe that original graphic that I had where we had the, kind of simplified like land capacity analysis and housing production strategy, if we look at the kind of changes that were made to it, it didn't so much like add new requirements or new components to it, but it took these existing requirements and it restructured them in a way that made for a comprehensive kind of statewide system that at the beginning plans for housing, and especially a lot more housing that we haven't been planning for historically. I think some that were mentioned were like second and vacation homes, housing for people experiencing homelessness, that type of thing. And then allocating that to local jurisdictions. But then also in the housing capacity analysis and production strategy, really emphasizing that what the goal here is achieving outcomes. So what we're going to do is we're going to be actually tracking, like, how are we doing? How many units are we producing? Which I know sounds very simple, but is something that we've never done historically before, like track how many units that we actually build, right? And we are going to use this information to determine whether or not, essentially we need to make interventions. Like, are there barriers that exist that prevent us from achieving our goals? And if so, we should do something about that, right? And I'll talk about all those components in the next couple of slides. But the short of this, what this graphic is supposed to show is that there's this broader kind of state and local partnership that happens in the implementation of Goal 10 that's really intended to reorient towards achieving outcomes, right? So again, I know this is a lot. I'm definitely going to be happy to stop for questions maybe at the end of this particular section, but give me a little bit of time to walk through these individual components. So I'm going to start on the left side of this graph here with the actual Oregon housing needs analysis itself. And this is kind of a responsibility, or I guess on the state side, this also includes the housing production dashboard. But stateside, this is divided between two agencies for the administering of the Oregon housing needs analysis and then tracking outcomes. So on the ONA side of it, you guys might be familiar with the Office of Economic Analysis. They are, I guess, a division or a subsection of the Department of Administrative Services, and they are the economists that are responsible for revenue forecasting, right? You guys might have seen revenue forecasting reports, things like that. Obviously, as it relates to the kicker, we have to estimate how much money we have, things like that. And it assigns them the responsibility for conducting the Oregon housing needs analysis. So what that means is every year, they're going to take the state, they're going to divide it into a series of regions based on essentially census data. And then what they're going to do is they're going to estimate need for each of those regions. They'll consider all these different components. I should mention this graphic's actually a little bit outdated because they've been refining this methodology over the course of the year. I'll talk about that in a minute. But once they estimate need and they kind of allocate them to different income groups, right? So there's different incomes in the state, different ability to afford housing, right? And so we have these different income brackets that we assign them to. But then once they have that need, they then allocate that down to cities and counties within that region. So that's pretty important. Essentially what that means is every kind of local government receives of the share of the overall housing need as part of their kind of region, right? And that's a 20-year need. That's something that's pretty consistent that we've been planning for. But it also establishes kind of an additional requirement. They also established this thing called housing production targets, which, if you think about 20 years of need, that's a very long time, right? And we can plan for that, but what we care about is achieving production, right? So what a housing production target is 8 years essentially of that 20-year need, right? Kind of recognizing, hey, we need to build housing now, like over the next, in the near term. And so we need a benchmark to be able to track and evaluate how we're doing on production. And that's what a housing production target is. So DAS is responsible for doing that. I'll talk a little bit later about this interim methodology. They've already been in the process of refining this a lot, but there are definitely some components that are going to be part of this methodology that historically were never considered ever before. And one of the, some of these are very important, like the idea of underproduction. Historically, we kind of assumed at year zero that we have enough housing units to meet need, which is not a good assumption in a housing crisis, right? So the basic idea here is, well, what units don't exist today that ought to exist, right? And that we feel in the form of housing shortage, higher rents, higher prices, all that kind of stuff. The second aspect of this is units that are lost to second and vacation homes. This is not planning to say like second and vacation homes themselves are a need, but rather that second and vacation homes take housing offline, right? And so if you have, a housing unit that's converted to a second or vacation home, you either have to replace that unit or you have to stop it from converting in the first place, right? So these units, it's intended to capture those units that are lost to second and vacation homes. This has a huge effect on the North Coast. I should mention, like it's very regional, right? And it affects recreation communities the most. The biggest impact is on the North Coast where there's a lot of second and vacation homes. And then lastly, oh, I'm also seeing somebody's off mute. I believe Elizabeth. Okay, great. And then the last piece is housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. These are folks that aren't actually traditionally captured via census data, right? And obviously existing information about people experiencing homelessness is spotty, but the intent here is to be able to capture that need and to, reflect it as a form of unmet housing need too in the entire methodology. I should mention, I'm not going to go into all the methodological nitty-gritty details. And this graphic actually is a little bit outdated. This was a version that was, kind of a refinement in the last biennium. Since that time, they've been thinking about it more. They've been thinking a lot about, how they structure the methodology, the allocation. They have a really cool webinar that kind of goes into detail on like what all of the specific parameters are. I highly recommend watching that because these are the experts who are talking about it. But then there's also a document that they published earlier this month, I believe like a week or two ago, that describes the interim methodology in exhaustive detail. And this is the most updated version that they are soliciting public comments on. They're going to kind of intake those. They're going to develop a refined version of the methodology, and then they're going to open for kind of further public testimony, things like that, before actually finalizing. But DAS will be making that final call. All right, moving over to OHCS. OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, they are the folks who handle affordable housing finance in the state of Oregon. And what they are assigned in terms of their responsibility is essentially tracking outcomes. They are directed to develop this housing production dashboard where they, have essentially production data, like how many units are we producing, how many affordable units are we producing, and what do outcomes in our communities look like over time, right? So if we divided the two responsibilities, DAS is responsible for the math, OHCS is responsible for tracking outcomes. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Again, let's take questions at the end of this section. I'm going to move over to DLCD's responsibilities. And where we are, kind of actively underway is in rulemaking right now about how we implement Goal 10 and how we structure this, how we structure the implementation of Goal 10 to get at achieving production affordability and choice. And I should mention, right, the applicability of this is to mostly cities above 10,000. There's some asterisks there that I'm not going to go into detail on. But pretty much essentially the goal of our rulemaking, and I won't go into just crazy amounts of detail about it. I think there's a lot that we could talk about here. But the legislature directed us to do rulemaking, and we have essentially three major topics that we're diving into. The first one is on housing needs and production. How do we reform or restructure Goal 10 to get us towards achieving production affordability and choice and affirmatively furthering fair housing? The idea that we actually embed equity and fair housing as just core principles to how we plan for housing in the state of Oregon. The second piece or second prong of rulemaking is on urbanization. And this is both in recognition that, hey, UGB expansions need to happen, right? And so we want to make sure that that process is straightforward, that local governments have the tools necessary to facilitate UGB expansions in response to need. And then also that we're not just considering how much land we're bringing into UGBs, we're thinking about how to make that land development ready. How do we ensure that that land will be ready to annex, be ready to serve with public infrastructure, be ready to actually develop with housing, right? Because all of the constituent, the requirements are set in place to ensure that that land is ready to actually support development. And then the third prong of rulemaking, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, is around this idea called the Housing Acceleration Program. And so I'm going to move to that slide. The basic premise behind this is, I mentioned that we're kind of evaluating and tracking how much housing we're producing over time. That's like a big part of this equation. And one of the things that we know is that these targets, these goals that we're setting for ourselves are very ambitious, right? We are planning for way more housing than we ever were in the past. And we know that our trajectory right now is not getting us there, right? The status quo is not working. And so what this policy intends to do, it's a new statute, that essentially says, well, if we're not meeting our goals, what do we do about it? And what the legislature has responded with is with a statute saying, DLCD, what you should do is you are going to be directed to kind of look into and evaluate barriers to production that could be happening at the local level, at least for cities that are applicable to the ONA, which are cities above 10,000. This is called the Housing Acceleration Program. And essentially what it is a responsibility for DLCD to kind of refer cities into this Housing Acceleration Program, where what we do is an audit. And we evaluate all the different barriers that can be happening to development at the local level. These could include local barriers, but they could also include state barriers, regional barriers, market barriers, all of these different kind of ranges of things that are both inside the city's control and outside of the city's control. And the basic premise of this is that we essentially reach an agreement to take actions. What are actions that DLCD can bring to the table? Technical assistance, funding, coordination, mediation, all those different types of things. And what are the actions that the local government can bring to the table to address barriers within our control? And ideally, coordinate with a lot of different branches of government that are necessary to make housing production happen. Right? So this is something that we're underway with rulemaking right now. I'll talk a little bit about that first draft that's kind of come out. But this is something just to keep in mind. This is a major part of the ONA policy, the idea that we would actually be taking actions within our control to remove barriers to production. All right, with that, before I pivot to start talking about how this kind of comes into play in Clatsop County, I want to take a minute. That was a lot of information, right? And I want to be sensitive to the fact that I imagine folks have a lot of questions, and I'm happy to kind of move around and respond to specific things based on folks' feedback. So I'm going to take a minute. I'm going to pause.
I'll start.
Yeah.
So have the numbers and forecasts been assigned to regions and or individual cities at this point?
Not yet. No. So there's a few things that are, so what the interim methodology does is it proposes a methodology for conducting the ONA, conducting the allocations. Like, so this is how they would reach the numbers, but they don't publish draft numbers, mostly because the data that would be used is not actually published yet. It's going to be published later this year.
Okay.
So that's, yeah. So you don't want to give folks a false impression that these are what the numbers will be, right? Because the data is, like not accurate. It's not updated. And so because of that, they're taking the interim methodology. They're saying, these are the methods that we're going to use to get at those numbers. And then with a later version that is published in September, the draft methodology, they will actually publish some preliminary numbers, like actual need estimates and allocations to cities and counties. I should mention that still will have some outdated information, but it'll be a lot more updated, and there'll be, appropriate caveats in place, that type of thing.
Just a quick follow-up. You talk about the HAP and you talk about the DLCD responsibility to figure out what's wrong. What if the problem isn't at the local level? What if the problem's at the state level?
Exactly.
Otherwise, all right, get this. It seems pretty onerous. That was choice word. Sorry.
Well, I would like to follow up on the housing acceleration program too, because I think that's of interest. And one of the questions I think is, how will DLCDs choose which jurisdictions are gonna be part of that? And how do jurisdictions sort of engage in that dialogue with the state?
Yeah. Okay. So there's two questions here. One on well, what about state barriers, right? And so one of the first things I want to emphasize is that the Housing Acceleration Program is all focused on addressing barriers that are within our control to do something about, right? And so one of the premises that we're kind of building into this draft rule is that what DLCD evaluates are barriers and looking at the intersections between, what might be going on at the local level, what might be happening at the regional level. Like maybe there's kind of like a regional service provider and there's an infrastructure barrier, right? That's obviously outside of a city's control. And then also looking at the stateside barriers. Maybe there's an ODOT facility that's at capacity, things like that. And to really identify and grapple with these and acknowledge them in the audit process overall, and then build in the place the mechanisms and processes in place to ensure that we're actually mediating and coordinating with different state agencies, different public bodies to actually address those barriers, right? So that's the intent. The intent is to build in that coordination over time and ideally to build partnerships. It's not just saying, hey, this is all in local governments. It's saying, no, barriers require a lot of different actions from different public entities, and that rule should reflect that. And what the rule should focus on is taking actions within our control to address those barriers. Does that help get at that question in particular?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Great. And yeah, our first draft rule actually talks a lot about this. It's pretty long. So if you folks want to dive into that, there's a lot more detail that's in there. But I'll speak to the other question, which is on referral. So I mentioned that the OHCS is developing this housing production dashboard that shows like what's our progress, how many units that we're building. What DLCD is directed to do is to use that information on outcomes for the purpose of referral. And what we're supposed to prioritize is kind of, where's the need most acute? Essentially, where are we seeing that we're the farthest behind our goals, right? And that's where we should focus our attention. Actually, it's a major question in rule making about like how precisely we do that. And so again, the first draft rules kind of articulate a first approach about like how we use the housing production dashboard to get at this idea of like, all right, where do we prioritize our resources for audits? And so that's something that I would definitely emphasize looking into. I could talk a lot about it, but there's like a lot of technical details that I mean, unless you guys want me to get into it, I won't do that for the sake of time. Yeah, Gail.
Yeah, so I have a question. There's a lot of emphasis, obviously, on working with jurisdictions and governments, but what actions, if any, are being taken to work with the development community to find out what their needs might be or what their barriers are that they're encountering, or even if we have a point where because of regulation or market inflation, whatever is going on, that the development community just doesn't want to develop anything. So how is that being incorporated?
Yeah, so there's a few places where that's being incorporated. The first one is that in the actual implementation of Goal 10, a big part that's embedded in there is that we want to make sure that we're actually talking to members in the development community, producers of needed housing. That includes obviously market rate developers, as well as affordable housing developers, to identify like where should a city prioritize different actions to facilitate production, affordability, and choice. So that's one tie-in, right, with the development community that's built into the Goal 10 process. The second place where that happens is when DLCD is actually conducting an audit. One of the things that we look at is like, hey, we should talk to the development community. Where are the barriers at, right? And so one of the things that you'll notice if you start to look at the first draft rules is that there's requirements in there to actually engage with different members of the community, different practitioners, different kind of leaders, that type of thing. There's a lot of lists about like who precisely we reach out to and what exactly we consider. It's a pretty long rule. But at the same time, it's explicitly building in this idea that we're going to be connecting with producers of housing and identifying, right, what are those market side barriers and where can we identify barriers that we can do something about, right? And the kind of final outcome of the audit is going to be considering that. What are the market factors that go into this? Are developers, are they struggling with things that are maybe outside of a city's control to help? Or are there like regulatory barriers or things that we can do to be able to address those barriers? So I hope that kind of gets at your question. It's built into the program, but it's a little bit subtle.
I think you can keep going, Sean.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to move on to talking about how this affects communities in Clatsop County. I think as Alyssa noted, like, if you think about like the requirements for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, the main kind of like statutory requirement for kind of applicability of the law is really based on population threshold. And mostly that's for cities that are above 10,000 population. So I think in this case, in the case of Clatsop County, that would be the city of Astoria. And that is essentially required Goal 10 planning on an 8-year cycle, right? So, doing the housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy on this 8-year cycle and, kind of participating in that overall program where we, track and evaluate production. If there are barriers, we kind of dive into and do an evaluation of that type of thing. But that's really the only like statutory applicability for this policy. However, for other jurisdictions in Clatsop County, including the county itself, as well as smaller cities who are not subject to the regular Goal 10 requirements, there are some pieces that I think folks can really take with them in the effort to address housing needs in the county overall. The first one is that for cities below 10,000 population, it's worth mentioning that Goal 10 is a statewide land use planning goal. It applies to all cities in the state of Oregon. And so the main thing here is that the regularly updating your Goal 10 documents is an optional task. You don't have to do it by any specific schedule, things like that. The previous requirement to update them, which was periodic review, is something that's defunct because the legislature doesn't fund it anymore. But the basic idea is that the rules and the funding and all of the program is designed to really support and incentivize cities that want to opt into the program. So if a city really wants to take on pro-housing policies, there's a lot of different options that are available, both to DLCD in terms of supporting those local governments, but then the local governments themselves to kind of pursue which actions feel right to them. And a lot of the rules are really going to be supporting that outcome for cities that kind of opt into that process. The other place where this happens, and I'll talk about this in the next slide. So again, counties, generally speaking, don't often do goal 10 planning because oftentimes they don't really interface with urban growth boundaries except when an expansion happens. But the basic idea of the ONA, and I'll talk about this, is this idea that like everybody has a responsibility to help and facilitate the production of housing. And one of the places that is a new opportunity for regional and county entities to really be able to step up in this is with something called a housing coordination strategy, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But then the last piece, I kind of want to emphasize the state side of things. Obviously, DLCD has heightened expectations, not only for just like funding, but also this broader idea of like coordinating with other state agencies and public bodies, doing the oversight, doing the kind of like identification of barriers, right? All of this implementation work to really support local governments in the production of housing. And then state agencies, I didn't actually finish out this bullet point, but there's an increasing recognition at the legislature and at different state agencies that we need to coordinate and we need to be directing our resources to actually facilitating the production of housing. I think that's something that you'll see in a lot of recent bills, even though it's not directly addressed as part of House Bill 2001. So I just want to emphasize that. And I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about something called a housing coordination strategy. And this is in recognition of the role that regional governments play, right? And this is a requirement for Metro, but it's optional for anybody, any other regional government or county. They can always opt into it. And basically, the idea here is that if we look at the housing production strategy, that's an 8-year action plan that cities take to promote the development of housing. This is the analog for regional entities. It's their plan, what their action plan is, what they want to do to support different folks, including local governments in their region, to facilitate the development of housing. And right, so those tools are regionally focused. They include things like resource sharing, coordination, technical support, identification of funding sources, all that type of stuff that regional entities can really step up with and provide. Of course, we decided, like the legislature decided, that like Metro should just be doing that, right? Especially for the Metro region. But we didn't want to close that opportunity off, or I should say the legislature didn't want to close that opportunity off for other regional or county governmental entities, right? So this is also an option where a county or a regional entity can really step up and say, here's our affirmative plan on how we want to approach housing production in our region. So that's one thing I just wanted to emphasize. And now I'm going to talk very quickly about process updates. But maybe before I do, I want to ask if there's any questions on kind of like applicability or kind of, how responsibilities are changing and as it relates to Clatsop County. Yeah, Gail.
Yeah, are there any plans to make this mandatory or required for rural communities, or how do rural communities and unincorporated communities play into this?
Yeah, so I should mention there's nothing in the bill that requires rural communities or unincorporated communities to plan for housing. There's an asterisk there for urban unincorporated communities in the Metro County because those are very big areas. But the idea here is that, especially when you look at small cities or rural areas or like urban, or I guess urban unincorporated communities, like say, I know they're very common in Tillamook County. The basic idea is that like they're very capacity constrained, right? And so like a mandate to plan for goal 10 that's a pretty significant undertaking. And that takes a lot of time, that takes a lot of resources, oftentimes that small capacity constrained jurisdictions often lack. And so the basic idea behind this is that the statewide policy should be encouraging and supporting and funding smaller and more rural communities and facilitating support for jurisdictions that want to take kind of proactive actions to facilitating production, but not implementing mandates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any plans in the future? Because it seems to me that that would be an opportunity where you could possibly incorporate some housing. Because I know that in Clatsop County, there are unincorporated rural communities that have water and sewer facilities that you possibly could used to increase density or provide more opportunities for different types of housing product? And I'm just curious. And we're actually undertaking that right now. But anyway, I just wanted to know. Thanks.
Yeah, so that would require future legislative action. This is a conversation that happened in Tillamook County, right, where they do have a lot of those urban unincorporated communities that are on water or sewer, that type of thing. And it resulted in a bill called Senate Bill 406 that required Tillamook County for these communities to essentially do goal 10 planning. They've like fully opted in to the mandates of state law, right? And that was kind of something that was led. DLCD actually didn't really participate in the development of that bill, but it was something that the legislature implemented kind of in partnership with leadership in Tillamook County, right? So it's not saying that like, you know, the legislature can do that for other jurisdictions too, but it would require legislative action, right? If you're trying to apply, right, these requirements of state law to these other communities. So that's just something I want to emphasize.
John, has there been any conversation about changing that 10,000 population threshold to a lower threshold? We've got a couple cities that are in the neighborhood, in the ballpark, and I just wanted you to comment on that.
So I know of no proposals or know of no conversations about lowering that threshold, right? I think that threshold of 10,000 in population that was set in 2019, and one of the things our recommendations emphasized is like, it's really hard to apply these mandates for really small capacity constrained cities because like sometimes they don't even have planning staff, right? And so that was kind of one of the things that we were like, we're not proposing changing that population threshold as part of our legislative recommendations, right? So it remained at 10,000. Of course, the legislature can always change things, right? Like the original middle housing bill that used to apply to cities above 10,000, the legislature changed that to apply to cities above 2,500, right? To allow duplexes. And so that's something that can happen in the future, but it requires legislative action.
Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right, well then, yeah, if there's no other questions, I can move on to kind of process updates.
Sounds good.
Okay, awesome. All right, so the main thing to emphasize here, right? So all of those policies, you know, the bill that was passed in 2023, it set a lot of kind of, you know, direction for both DAS, OHCS, DLCD to kind of really engage in actually developing and setting up the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program for implementation. And that includes a lot of different elements, obviously the establishment of the methodology itself, which I'm going to talk about, but also rulemaking that's happening at DLCD. And I would say that we're at a very good, like maybe halfway point in the rulemaking, and we've kind of reached an initial milestone. So I'll mention just as kind of a reminder, I mentioned that there were 3 prongs of rulemaking. The first one focused on needs and production. So like, how do we facilitate needs and production within our communities? The second one focused on capacity and urbanization, right? UGBs, facilitating development readiness of land, all that type of stuff. And then obviously the housing acceleration program, which I've talked about too. The first and the third, the needs and production and housing acceleration, they are due January 1st of 2025. So at the end of this year, right? And so one of the things that we're doing, we're kind of engaged in this rulemaking process. We're about at the halfway point, and we've published a first draft of rules. I actually have 2 links below here, one that kind of points to a plain language summary of those rules. So if you're like, I don't want to read your technical jargon, you can understand what they do. And then there's also one that's like a more in-depth matrix with like the actual draft rule language, a lot more detailed explanation, policy notes, that type of thing, that really dive into the nerdy details. That's something that we have available. And obviously we have availability of public comment. I'll talk about where you can submit those in a minute, but we expect this to be refined a lot before we get to the final kind of rule deadline. And then the other thing I'll mention when it comes to capacity and urbanization, that's due a year later. So January 1st of 2026. They've been engaging in preliminary conversations on capacity and urbanization, you know, the team, overall the DLCD team, but we haven't really started rulemaking for that yet, and we won't start until the beginning of next year. So that's something to also be apprised of, and that will be developing in 2025. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. Definitely, I encourage reviewing it, encourage providing comments, submitting those to DLCD. We are looking to refine and make sure that this is implementable on the ground. That's something that we really, really are trying to emphasize with this. The second aspect that I'll mention, and on this too, I also want to emphasize there's one additional opportunity to kind of be able to participate and engage in conversation, which is that we are, DLCD staff is holding a regional conversation on housing, on the administrative rules that we're kind of working to develop. And really the intent here is just to have a broad conversation with different folks in different regions to kind of talk through like what are the things that we should be addressing in these, right? Especially as they relate to the regions that you guys work in, right? And obviously, lend your expertise to that. That's something that we have scheduled for August 12th. That's from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Provided a link in here. I'll also provide the slides here just so that way folks have them. And that's something we would encourage attending and encourage, inviting others to. So that's something we would really like to emphasize. And of course, that's not the only way that you can get involved, but it's something that we would really, really love to help facilitate. All right, and then on the methodology itself, right? So I mentioned that there's an interim methodology that was published by DAS. I guess by DAS and OHCS and DLCD, we're all kind of partnering on it. And essentially the point of this is to kind of get the first version of the methodology out there, or I guess a refined version of the methodology out there, and that we're going to host for public comment until August 16th. So please take a review of that. There's a webinar that's available on OHCS's website that really talks in detail about what all is in it. I definitely encourage listening to that if you have the time. And you can submit comments to either OHCS, and there's an email address there, or to DLCD, and that's our email address for receiving public comments. You can send us anything related to either this or the draft rules themselves, and we'll of course compile them. We'll use this feedback to develop a set of draft rules that we hold open for public testimony and comment. And that's where we'll actually publish like preliminary numbers, right? And so that will be available in September. And there'll be 2 meetings where folks can sign up for testimony, that type of thing. And of course, any feedback will be then incorporated into a final set of recommendations that we send off to DAS. And then DAS can kind of do whatever they want. They actually make the decision on this. So they could totally ignore anything that we recommend. So just keep that in mind as we kind of get into there. But yeah, DAS will be the decision maker on that final methodology.
Sean, if I could quickly ask, what is DAS? What is DAS?
The Department of Administrative Services. They're the folks who kind of do all of the administrative functions of keeping the state running. So things like writing checks, keeping, HR, all that type of stuff. And specifically, this branch of DAS is the Office of Economic Analysis. These are the economists who do revenue forecasting for the state.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So with that, I think we are essentially at the end of the presentation. I did have the 2024 legislative updates, but I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we probably don't need to dive into that. There's a lot of bills that are going on related to like funding or statewide coordination. I won't talk about it for the sake of time. And so instead, what I'll do is I will thank you guys for inviting me to speak.
Thank you.
I'm realizing something.
Oh.
I am realizing something very important. I forgot to share my screen.
Only for the second
Oh
half.
man, that's embarrassing.
We're so
Well, I'll share these slides afterwards, but so you weren't missing much. There was just a bunch of text on the screen, that type of thing. We had the housing coordination strategy. We had the process update, and there's some links here. I'll send this out after the meeting today. And then, of course, we have the regional conversations. We've got the draft methodology. You're not missing much with these slides.
How come you don't know what DAS means?
Luckily your words were so detailed, Sean, that we didn't need the visuals.
Sorry about that.
Actually, thanks very much for all of that. It's great for us to be able to hear from you directly and get us all in one room. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for all your work. And it's nice to see you in a meeting where I don't have to be part of making rules and giving technical advice. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course.
Want to ask him anything or bring up any other topics? All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
All right.
So when did you all know that he was talking and there were slides that were supposed to go?
The second link here. I was like,
Right below.
It's like there's something below.
It's funny because Gail texted me saying, is he not showing the slides? And I said.
I know, Robert was like, I'm not doing anything.
All right. Anyway,
I thought that was useful, informative, especially for the city of Astoria, I think in particular, who's gonna be on the hook. And, I sit on some of these committees, the rulemaking and technical committees, and they talk a lot about this housing acceleration program, which to me sounds like a performance improvement program for employees who are underperforming. I don't think we want to be underperforming in Clatsop County, but I think we do actually have some barriers. So that's why I wanted him to really tease that out so that we all can avoid being that problem employee, or the problem jurisdiction. But there'll be many opportunities to keep talking about it, as you can see.
One of the things I would like to ask the group is individually as cities, cities, counties, we should all look at that data, even though it does not directly apply to every city and county now, it could. And he did say, you know, the legislature has done this before. It could be applied to other cities at some point in time, in particular Warrenton and Seaside, because they're the 5,000 up. So I'm just saying, we as staff probably should take some time and talk about how that could impact us as a community.
Well, and I think the work we're doing now with this buildable land inventory, housing inventory, infrastructure inventory is gonna be very informative. And will set the stage for us understanding what our barriers and needs are for housing production. And will give us essentially a regional look across every jurisdiction at once. And so I think that's a really good basis for it. I think this idea of a regional housing coordination strategy, or whatever he called it, might be a logical next step for us once we have sort of a regional shared understanding of our issues and challenges. How we might partner with the city who is required to do the work and sort of lift things up regionally, because we all already know by sitting in this room how tight our destinies are with each other. That perhaps putting together a regional housing strategy might be the way to preempt more requirements. Hey, we're opting in, we're coming up with our own proactive approach. We don't need the state to tell us what we need to do. We're working together on that. And given frankly, the leadership that you and Gail are already showing at the county, I think there's a good opportunity for that to continue. So that may be something we want to talk about in the future, once we've got this first piece of work done, whether we want to work together on the regional coordination strategy. And again, I think we have advantages by having public and private partners at the table. This isn't just all government when we have CMH or private developers. I think it actually makes us more effective in thinking about how we might produce housing together.
Does that regional approach offer us flexibility in the sense that Astoria isn't necessarily going to solve all of the housing issues in Astoria? We have to look at the bigger community perhaps. Does that give us that flexibility?
That's my understanding based on what I've heard from DLCD and what Sean is saying. I actually think that regional coordination thing is still under development a little bit, right? It's basically an urban area tool that is now applicable for other jurisdictions. And, you know, we've got a couple regional agencies at the table here in addition to the county. We got Colpack, we got Crest, like we have a good regional infrastructure here. And so how we might apply this program to us, I think there's some opportunity to still figure that out.
Okay.
So.
I don't think there's any question that, you know, between the 5 cities of the county, it's about 25 miles, right?
Exactly.
That's exactly like, you know, big urban area like Portland Metro is.
That's a good one.
And every time I go anywhere, that's what I say, is we're kind of like just a big town here in the county. I don't want to, you know, put Jewel and Napa and whatever else aside, but you know, right here, we all, you know, people work in Cannon Beach, live in Seaside, live in Warrenton, and work in Seaside and all that. We have to do it together. Because, you know, we're all fairly small. We're pretty close in size, actually.
Exactly, and our workers and our homes and our jobs, like how many of us have been in more than 2 or 3 of the jurisdictions just today alone, right? We've all passed through several of them, so I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly right, and we started this discussion early on, that this whole idea of, you know, can't we put ourselves together as a region to have all this analysis, in which, you know, brought us along with what we're doing as a region now. And it's certainly, if having a regional strategy in place helps mitigate some of the concerns in Astoria, because we do have so many limitations. And if we can, I mean, this whole talk about barriers and removing barriers, I hope it's more than talk. I hope it's stuff that people are really gonna find solutions to. And once they're pointed out, say, I see that, here's what we can do. So I think this is a really important discussion, and I hope that we hold their feet to the fire, and you're there at the table.
Right.
So, you know, you're getting this.
Well, and as Sean pointed out, the two things that the legislature did not act on are providing funding and making the state work better together. Which probably if we all went around this table and said, what are the two things that would help us address our barriers the most? It would probably be those two things. And so I do think that that continues to be an important conversation for us.
All right, I think we've
Wait,
got.
can I clarify that? Can I clarify that?
Okay, all right.
So, sorry, just listening in. The legislature's not doing nothing on it. They just didn't address it in House Bill 2001. So a lot of the bills that I was mentioning in 2024, yeah, those actually they made a huge investment in housing production in 2024. They established the Housing Accountability and Production Office, which actually has an explicit role in statewide coordination. Like they're doing stuff about it, but it's all nascent. And we expect it to be more bills, more conversation as we get into 2025 and beyond. So I just want to emphasize that it's not like the state's not like they're not taking up those parts. It's just that it wasn't part of that bill.
Oh, I'm just totally pandering to my audience. You gotta.
Oh yeah, totally. I didn't want that to be like said like, yeah, the state's not going to do anything, you know.
But actually,
That's not.
will you talk a little bit more about where things are with HAPO? Because I do think that that's something that we're interested in learning the next steps about.
Yeah, totally. So so the HAPO, it's called the Housing Accountability and Production Office. It's a joint office between DLCD and the Building Codes Division. And really essentially what their job is, you can kind of break it down into two primary functions. The first one is, you might have noticed, there's been a lot of housing laws that have been passed by the legislature in recent years. And the kind of first job that the HAPO has is really around making sure that those are, you know, kind of implemented, that we are working with, say, both cities and local developers to kind of address those barriers that might be happening at the local implementation level. Like maybe there's a conflict over driveway access standards or X, Y, and Z, that type of thing. And then the second role that the HAPO has is on statewide coordination among agencies, specifically agencies that touch on the development process, right? So like DEQ gets involved during wastewater. OHCS gets involved on funding. ODOT gets involved on transportation, and ensuring that these agencies actually talk with each other and coordinate well on the goal of like housing production. Again, all very nascent. The office is still being stood up. We actually have to hire a bunch of people, and we're like just getting authorization to even start doing that. But that's something that's going to be kind of growing and evolving over the coming years.
Well, and to your point, the state's not doing nothing around coordination and funding. That's actually going to hopefully be an important vehicle for some of what you talked about in terms of helping address barriers at the state level.
Yeah, totally. And I'll even just add, what's more, right? They made big investments in 2024. They're going to make big investments in 2025, and they want to know, like, how do we best support like funding housing that the market wouldn't otherwise produce? Like, we want to make sure that we're doing that right. So that's definitely a place where like getting in touch with your legislators, obviously talking with DLCD, should we have events on that type of thing, which I believe we have some direction around that. Just to like get that idea out there and be like, yeah, we care about state funding. Here's how we best do that, right? Here's how we best allocate limited resources. It's going to be a very important conversation. So definitely encouraged to be involved in that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Other thoughts?
Glad he's listening.
No, I'm not. No, I'm kidding.
Heartbreak. The state agencies still have the mindset, though, it's individual cities. DLCD is really the only one that I've come across that really is open to the idea of everybody kind of working together. I point back to the homelessness issue. Every city, every county has to do their own thing. We have Gerhardt, Cannon Beach, us, we can't work together and do something regionally. So.
Not to be like Sean, but we do have the multi-agency coordination group that's working on the executive order funding, and that actually is the best table where more than one jurisdiction is coming to the table. You guys have been great leaders in that.
Involved in that, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's more of a county type thing doing it as opposed to the state saying, yeah, it's okay to work together.
Yes, exactly. Don't get me started on that whole process.
I know.
That's a challenging state agency conversation, but at least we have resources to start addressing the problem.
And then we have FEMA.
Yeah, it's a good thing our commissioner walked out.
Yeah. FEMA is a 4-letter word, I hear.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a challenge.
Building on its reputation.
It is, absolutely. Any other questions or discussion around this particular topic? From up top or around the table here? All right, Alyssa,
Obviously, we'll have more conversation
We
on
will.
the state stuff, so
Yeah.
if anyone wants to follow up, please let me know. And now for something totally different. So the gentleman sitting next to me, this is the first time I've met him in person, but he is someone I've heard great things about from my friends and my housing friends from other parts of the state. And his name is Paul, and he works as a consultant, I believe. He's come to our county he's here to help, right?
No, I did not say that.
What he's told me is he is starting to work in Clatsop County, and he's in listening and learning mode. And I thought that this would be an important group to essentially have a connection with and have a conversation with. So, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Lindbergh, that's literally all I know about him.
It shows you're in the room listening. Here, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. I'm really gonna count the number of times I see this. Oh, really?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for letting me take up some of your time today. I'm gonna give you a little bit of background as to who I am and why I'm here. And what some of the ideas are, and then part of, as Alyssa said, I'm here to sort of figure out and help, or not help, but figure out what some of the needs are in the community. I am a consultant. I've worked with nonprofits for my entire adult career, which is almost 30 years now. Started out back in the great state of Minnesota. There we go.
Oh, trifecta. Oh, my God. I knew I liked you.
There's three of you.
Yeah.
There's rules that apply, but
I
not.
can't tell you.
No, that's Wisconsin. And I moved out, moved down to Oregon. If you're from Wisconsin, I'm gonna cut you off. I moved out to Oregon about 25 years ago. I live in Hood River. And I work out there and I work across the state, and over the last few years started to work a little bit more nationally as well. And when I started out as a consultant, when I moved out to the Gorge, I said yes to everything, anything nonprofit related. I said yes to setting up nonprofits, taking them down, board development, strategic planning, fundraising, of course. Anything anybody asked me to do with nonprofits, I said yes, whether I knew how to do it or not. Grant writing has always been sort of my bread and butter through the years. And about 10, 11 years ago now, some folks from Providence Hood River Hospital were sitting around after a meeting lamenting the fact that we as a community were missing out on some big funding opportunities. We didn't have enough coordination to know who was doing what. We didn't have a good idea of data and resources and keeping an eye on funding opportunities that would be coming. And we didn't have anybody who could do all that and write a grant. And so they decided to use some of their community benefit dollars, their local dollars, to essentially hire and design a program to create a community grant writer. And that's me. They reached out to me. I'd worked with all of them before. We designed this model that we call Collective Impact Health Specialist. I didn't come up with the title, they did. It's a fancy word. Like I said, it's community grant writing. And the model, I was originally tasked with three things. The first of which was to help identify community needs. The second was to convene and facilitate conversations amongst partners to design programs that address those needs, and then go find funding to support those programs. And rather than sort of open up the door to a free grant writer to everybody in the community, we put two criteria on the projects that I work on. The first of which is it has to address a need identified in our community health improvement plan. So it has to be something identified in our CHIP or our CHA. And in the Gorge, we use the CHIP and CHA that is led by the CCO. So that's kind of our basis out there. And so it has to meet community identified need, and the project has to be collaborative. There have to be at least two, if not three or more partners involved in the project itself. And for us, collaboration is defined as each partner gets funding from that funding source. So a letter of support is not enough to meet that collaborative criteria. And so under this model, we've designed and implemented more than 100 programs they all address needs in our community health improvement plan. And we brought in just a little over $32 million in grants to support those programs. And we have, more importantly, I think, we have developed this culture of collaboration out there where folks work together. And they work together now without having to go through me. So at first I was the dot connector and facilitating all the meetings, and now in the Gorge, there are meetings like this where people voluntarily show up and talk about issues and want to do stuff. So, and then about 6 months ago, the folks at Providence State, the regional office, I call it the home office in Portland, reached out and asked if I thought this model could be replicated somewhere in another Providence community. And I said, yes, we can do that. And we started to look at their other communities. So Providence has 4 hospitals outside of Portland: Hood River, Seaside, Newburgh, and Medford. So we looked at each of those 3 other communities. Medford, we kind of ruled out for a variety of reasons. And the more that we looked between Newburgh and Seaside, the similarities between Seaside, Clatsop County, and the Gorge are pretty similar. And it's there's just a lot of things really lined up. So we decided to go for it. And go back in April, I started to do what I call this landscape review. And essentially what I'm doing now is just trying to figure out what the needs are. And I can read the assessments and the CHIP and all of that, and that's great. But to hear from folks specifically what those needs are, like what are the nuances around housing? Yeah, housing's a need, but what's, as you all know, obviously. And so I've been doing this, and now for the last few months, and now I'm starting to join more meetings like this, where there are groups of folks, partners, providers already coming together who are working on an issue. Because my job essentially is to provide a resource to groups like this to help write collaborative grants. Like, that's it. I'm not a content expert. I've been doing this for an awful long time. My expertise is really in grant writing. It's not an expertise in housing. It's not an expertise in food security or transportation or sense of community, or those are all the topics that are in our CHIP in the Gorge. And so I rely, the whole process relies on you guys as the content experts to design the best program that you can to address that need. And then my job is to either translate that into a grant application and get it written and get it submitted, or go find funding to support that program, sort of depending on how the process goes. So, and I want to make very clear, I do not represent Providence Seaside Hospital in any way, shape, or form. They are simply the sort of leverage point to get me into the community. I'm not writing grants on behalf of Providence. They will, in all likelihood, not be involved in the majority of the grants that I work on. And the money, an important thing. In the Gorge, that 32 million that we raised, or that we got through grants, virtually none of that went to Providence. And so all of the grants that we wrote that are written were written for and on behalf of and in partnership with community-based organizations. So those organizations are the lead applicant. We do the process, the grant is written in their name, it's their board of directors that are listed. Every partner who's in that project works on it, they provide their own content. And then we all work through a budget together. So when an application is submitted, every partner who's listed in there knows exactly how much they're gonna get if we're awarded, and they know exactly what their responsibilities are going to be if we get funded. So if a grant comes in, there isn't anybody who says, oh, I thought we were gonna get 200,000 out of this to do this. Like, that just doesn't happen, because we do all that work ahead of time. And yeah, that was the other thing. That was the thing, that Providence doesn't get any money. I'm not working on behalf of Providence here. Oh, the other thing is in the Gorge, I get paid from Providence, the Hood River Hospital's local community benefit dollars. they take their local dollars and we have a contract. For Clatsop County, I'm not getting paid from the local hospitals community benefit dollars, it's from the state office. So Providence Seaside Hospital's amount of community benefit they have to give away does not change under this, so, yeah, and that's kind of my spiel. I don't have a PowerPoint to not share with you. He's still on.
No, he's not. Well played, well played.
You can tell he wasn't wanted, I think.
He could read the room. Yeah, and so really, this is, like I said, I'm in this very much this listening and learning mode. And we're not planning on starting to work on any specific applications until probably later this fall. And what those are gonna be, don't know. Still kind of trying to see what's gonna be up and running and available at the time. So when he said that, you know, the state's got some funding opportunities around all of this stuff, and they're not quite ripe yet, I still want to know what those are, right? So I can start to track those and pay attention. So when somebody says, oh, this is open, because we don't always get the long ramp up time, you know, to apply for these things. And the more organized we can be ahead of time, the better luck we're gonna have at getting something good submitted. So that's my spiel. Happy to answer any questions whatsoever.
So you don't just write the grants, you actually sort of prospect, keep your eyes out, look for opportunities proactively, or is it more reactive?
It's both. It's both. So, like I said, I've been doing this forever, so I'm on a ton of listservs of funding opportunities that come across my desk automatically. And there's somebody who works with me, her name's Claire. She's 3/4 time. She does the exact same stuff, and she's in Portland. Lives in Portland, but she's writing a grant today for mental health, you know, for stuff in the gorge. So it's more than just me.
Do you need a house in Clatsop County?
Do I need a?
Because there aren't any, so you know.
So I'm hearing.
Yes.
You have one on Zoom.
Oh,
Yeah, oh, therefore, yes, go right ahead.
So a couple of things. I should just introduce myself. I'm Leslie Ford, and I'm the regional housing advisor. I'm stealing from your task force. I'm the housing advisor for Columbia Pacific CCO. And about 5 years ago, we did stand up a regional housing impact fund, and we've been doing some of the pieces that you talked about for the last almost 5 years now. We also, as the CCO, have just completed the Community Health Improvement Plan. You have to refresh those every 5 years. That's a really broad-based plan, and Clatsop County was very involved in that process. We interviewed, I think, 3,300 residents to get the data for the health improvement plan, and for you all to know, housing was in the top 3 priorities, as it was last time around, 5 years ago. So there's a big support from the CCO about our housing efforts. We've been able to so far invest, we're going into $6 million, and that's all leveraged money. So we contribute a piece, and then that's usually leveraged by many times the amount that we contribute to an application or to a project. So we should talk because we're swimming in the same pool, and that would be great to have that resource. And then the other question I had is, when you do the applications, do you do the OHCS applications? Do you work on that part of the team at all?
I've worked in the gorge. I've worked with the Mid-Columbia Housing Authority. I've worked with our Community Action Council out there. And I've done some of those applications. I tend to try to stay away from some of those more technical things and leave that to the experts.
Yeah, they're really complicated.
Yeah. So yes and no. Like it's not my favorite. Like I'm not sure it's anybody's favorite.
No, it's not.
But it's one of those things where if I can help as a resource, then I'll try to help. And we should meet, Leslie, because one of the things, so in the gorge, I was the chair of our community advisory council through the CCO. So I sat on our CCO board for about 3.5 years, so I'm familiar with the funding streams, and I do have questions about the CCO here and sort of how it all works, because you're 3 counties, we were 2 counties and all that, so I'd love to get together if that's a possibility.
That would be just fine. Also, we do work pretty closely with Providence Seaside. So we have coordinating meetings once a month with the leadership there. So that might be something at some point that would be useful for
Yeah.
you.
That'd be great.
Can't help but note we have another healthcare institution in the room. And I guess that's the question. I assume that you work with all the healthcare institutions, or there's openness to that.
In the gorge, we are limited to organizations that are working to make the community healthier. So it's a pretty, and we use a very broad definition. So, yeah, anybody who's working to make the community healthier, I'll get your contact. Yeah.
Yeah, some good connections there.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can you give us some examples? You said 32 million.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of maybe like 2 or 3 highlight projects that you look back and you're like, man, those were super impactful, or, because you said similar communities, things that, help us kind of jog our brains or go back to our, the different people in our organizations and kind of flag for them.
Yeah, so, some folks have asked, like, what's the size of grants, like, that we've got? And so the smallest has been 5,000, the largest has been 2.3 million. The 2.3 million is over, it's one of my favorites. It's an after-school program. It's a 21st century grant, and it's a 5-year commitment, 5-year program that serves Title I schools, so schools that have the lowest income. And it's after-school programming, both academic and just activities, and then it's summer school as well. So we've got that. We've got that 3 years in a row for Hood River County. And I also do quite a bit of work across the river in Clickitat County in Washington. And so a whole different CCO model, but, oh yeah, you've got
I'm a part-time resident.
that's right. I'm gonna come knocking on your door. So that's been a nice one. It's one I always think of because it's the biggest sort of single chunk. And then also related to schools is we were able to set up, school-based health services, school-based health centers in Hood River and White Salmon School District, Dufour School District, and now we're working on the Dalles School District in the Dalles. And there's a program that we launched several years ago called Veggie RX, which it's essentially providers, healthcare providers and public health folks. They identify their patients who are suffering from food insecurity. They provide then, if they check the box yes, they give them vouchers that can be used at the farmer's market in the summer and the grocery stores in the winter to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. And it's one of my favorites because at one point it was the largest Veggie RX program in the country. And we burned through the initial grant funding in about a quarter of the time we had thought. It's also my favorite because it's one of the most annoying ones to get funding for. We have to repeatedly convince funders that eating fresh fruits and vegetables is a good idea. And it can make people healthier. So it's a striking one. And I think one of the most impactful ones that we've done is several grants around training more community health workers. And so we've got in the gorge, we have more community health workers per capita than anywhere in the country. And we don't have a big population, so, but we've got more than 100, we've trained more than 100 community health workers in the gorge. And that's a model that really has become embedded in the community out there. And it's an incredibly effective way.
So what's a community health worker?
Community health worker is somebody who is trained in skills to work with clients, folks with lived experience, who those folks typically have that lived experience themselves. So it's somebody who's houseless or somebody who comes from the community. It's a model that comes originally from South and Central America. And so it's rooted in the Latino community primarily, but that's not a requirement any longer for the community health worker model to be implemented. And so folks get trained in various things such as trauma-informed communication styles. And there's a model called popular education, which is a way of holding meetings. And one of the key tenets of popular education is everybody's an expert in their own lived experience. So everybody then is respected for their expertise and the experience that they bring to a conversation, whether they're a client or they're a CEO. And so there's a very intentional, it's part of a very intentional movement to effort to make sure that folks with lived experience have as much input into the issues and policies that are decided as the folks who are theoretically the decision makers. And so community health workers are navigators, they're social workers, they're peer support specialists, they're folks who are working one-on-one with community members and trying to connect them, help them support however they can, and then connect them and refer them to the services that they might need in the community.
But they're also some of the lowest compensated in our community and also facing housing instability and a lot of issues that we're trying to address too. So it's all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We, we do have community health workers in our 3-county region as well. So for you all to know, they do have to be credentialed, so they have to go through a training process and they have to get a certificate. And once they go through that whole credentialing process, we are happy to deploy that. I really agree. It's a completely effective model. And it's really working with the community itself to help our members navigate services. So it's we have been limited by the amount of training spaces that we have available to get people credentialed. That's been a real bottleneck in the state. But I think we're working pretty hard to open that up so there's more training capacity and we can move people through that process. We really support it and we really want to grow it.
Yeah.
Where does the training come? Where's the training facility? I want to be one.
Right.
And where do I go?
You can get in touch with me and I'll hook you up with the people who are doing the training. It's not one facility. We run it in various locations. And if we get enough of a critical mass, as soon as we have more capacity, which we're working on right now, then again, we can hold the trainings wherever the largest group of people who are interested in getting trained.
The volunteer?
No, it's a paid position. And the CCO does reimburse community health workers at a specific rate. But that's why we have to have you credentialed in order to be eligible for the agency that sponsors you to get reimbursement.
So another example is somebody who is retired and was credentialed, a social worker, and says, I want to get involved in the community. These would be opportunities for them to find a place, or
These are more, community health workers are more like lay staff. They are not necessarily professionally credentialed. In fact, they are not professionally credentialed. If you have somebody who's a credentialed social worker who wants to go to work, we can plug them in a million places. So we have a huge workforce shortage in that arena. So it's really aimed at it's kind of a built up peer model, if you will, that the CCOs have kind of developed over the last several years.
And it's a model that, if you think about sort of the person, I would say, well, I don't say, but folks who describe this say, when you're growing up, there's always somebody in the neighborhood or somebody in the community who you called for help. Like, oh, I'm gonna call Mrs. So-and-so, or I'm gonna call Mr. So-and-so, he's gonna help me out. In the definition, they're the community health worker, right? Because they're the person you call for help. They're from your community and they know they can help you answer your question and get you connected to what you need. That's, in simple terms, that's what a community health worker is. And so if you think of sort of I've been around long enough to folks who work at nonprofit organizations, who work for any typical program in a nonprofit, or social service agency, I should say. Like somebody calls and says, oh, I need help with this. Okay, I can help you. I'll connect you to this person. I'll connect you to that person. that's what the community health worker does. They typically do that though from a position of being, again, from that community. And the training that she's talking about, it's no small feat. It's 90 hours of training. And so there's a lot that goes with it. And it's a model that thankfully the CCOs have been starting to really lean more into, because it's been difficult to get that model and get those folks recognized as critical pieces in the healthcare spectrum, in the healthcare, just the line of work that folks need. It's less than a primary care provider. It's less than a medical person. It's more than somebody who you call. It is like somebody has some skills and some real knowledge, and they're connected into the system. So, and they're not paid anywhere near enough. So, yeah.
I would note that a community health worker needs to be an employee of one of our contracted, in order to be reimbursed with one of our contracted providers. So we've got a large network. Almost everybody who provides healthcare and social services in the region is a contracted provider, but the community health workers are a part of the staff of an agency or an organization. They're not free agents.
Right. And they can also be you can also be a community health worker for an agency that is not contracted with the CCO. Like that's not a requirement for the community health worker to work as a community health worker. We can write grants to say, for somebody who's not part of the CCO's contracting, to pay for a community health worker to do their work. So, yeah, a lot of opportunities in there. And that's obviously the discussion here demonstrates that's one of the most impactful programs that we've done.
It's awesome.
I'm pretty sure we could think of grants we might want. Or that we might.
There's probably 30 ideas floating around here in various
Exactly.
stages.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because you're in this group that's kind of a mix of the sort of policy development, right? We've talked about the other group that meets, which is our sort of more homelessness focused group, and I think you'll find similar conversation there and similar need there. Steve and I were just talking about how often we get calls just in the sort of people looking for a place to find housing, and they're calling the community development director of Cannon Beach, which isn't probably the best place to start, no offense.
Thank you for your help.
You're like, somebody needs help, right? How do I get them connected into the system? And so I think there is this connection between sort of the community development side and the sort of health services side, that something like what you're talking about could really bridge the gap. And we've got all the cities here, so.
We also have the Clatsop chart group, which is the Community Health Action Resource Team.
Yes.
Which is
I am. I'll be at
Okay.
the next meeting.
Oh, I will be there too. That's great. That's interesting.
Yeah. And where I'm assuming you're going with your comment about everybody has grant ideas. I think I'm on the email. My email's on the invite list for this.
Yes, and I can make sure people get it.
Yes. So like I said, I'm in this listening and learning mode. So if you have specific grants that you are interested in pursuing, or you've got ideas, send me an email. I'm happy to hear about them. Happy to jump on a call. And I'm out every couple of weeks for in-person stuff. So happy to sit down and have an in-person meeting. The caveat is I am only 1.75 people. And so there is limited capacity.
Yeah.
But I am much more comfortable having multiple things in the mix than sort of sitting around waiting for things to happen, because when it comes to grant writing, and anybody who's ever put a grant together will understand this, the writing itself of the application is really only about 25% of the process of submitting a grant application. The other 75% is planning and making sure you've got everything all lined up. And that's the work that you can start to do before you've got a specific funding opportunity in front of you. And so, yes, to your question of, can we start to talk about these things? Absolutely. And sorry, one last thing on the policy, everybody, you guys are a lot of policy makers, policy decision makers. I am a big fan of the idea that we have to address both the people who are standing in line today, and we have to work to shorten that line for next week. And the way to do that is to change policy. We can't program our way out of these issues. You can't continually create new programs to simply solve the problem. That only addresses the symptoms. We have to address the underlying conditions, and that's through policy change. Even if it's small policy, even if not small policy, even if it's local policy, even if it's organizational policy. Sometimes those things can have more impact than a big state legislative change. So I encourage you, if you're thinking of those things, you know, let's talk about that as well, because those are things that can have dramatic impacts, dramatic ripple effects down the road somewhere.
Do you support communities in building that capacity as well as 1.75 FTE? Because I know in Warrenton, we struggle with even having the time and the resources to put together grants.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly. And so that's how it would work, is if, let's say you guys had you saw a funding opportunity came across your desk. You're like, oh, this looks like it fits exactly what we want to do with this particular project, but we don't have the time. Give me a call. We then I'd sit down and look at it and say, okay, you know, we talk through the funding opportunity. And if it's something that fits, who are the other partners? Let's get into it and start to pull the different pieces together. So yes. And sorry, one last.
No, you've already used your last thing.
Well, then the free money. I
Yeah,
can't talk
okay,
about that. The region, even though this is sort of anchored through Providence Seaside Hospital, the region is Clatsop County. So it's countywide. It isn't just focused on Seaside. It isn't just focused on, like I said, the hospital, and the catchment area. It is the entire county. So that's what we're looking at.
I was just gonna ask you, right, you've been in listening and learning, you've met a bunch of people, and obviously you have a lot more to do. Are there things that you're starting to pull as themes around needs in Clatsop County, or what are you learning about us?
Well, I mean, this is the topic that keeps coming up at every conversation. You know, it's the beginning and end of every conversation for everything you can think of, for, you know, the housing itself, for economic development, for job development, for, you know, anything, mental health, like it's all, and it's all related to this particular issue. I don't know how to solve the problem, but you guys do, right? You may not think you do, but collectively you do.
No, the
right?
state does.
Yeah. Clearly, the state's doing a really good job. That's a big issue that I keep hearing about. Mental health is a big issue I keep hearing about. And then economic development is a big piece I keep hearing about. And even more recently, you know, with the habitat conservation plan, that sounds like that's going to be an incredible impact on the community. So that's one thing that I wish we would have done differently in the gorge when we got started. I wish I would have engaged more elected officials and more government bodies from the beginning. We just didn't. I was only 0.5 FTE at that point. I got bigger. And that's one group that, back to that idea of policy change, that's where I wish we would have started that process earlier there. So this is a chance to sort of collective impact 2.0, and with all of you guys who are city and county officials, you know, already at the table, already having these discussions, it makes that part of starting that much easier.
Yeah, you know, one thing I've noticed just from my work is I sit on a lot of state committees to represent the county, and mostly in housing one way or the other, and there's just a sort of an urban focus of the state's funding, policy, attention, and obviously there's an impact reason for that, and you've probably seen this in the gorge too, and
Right.
so I think one of the things that I would put on the table that could be useful is sort of finding opportunities at the state to lift up the voice of Clatsop County, to try to align our goals with the criteria. And I'm sure this is something you have some experience in terms of getting that voice heard at that level.
There's some, although I will say that I don't know, the folks who run the Mid-Columbia Housing Authority, they're the best at that in the gorge. Like, they do that better than any other agency or any other sector. And so, I always sort of just, Joel Mattson was the guy, and so I always just relied on, he used to run. But I was just relied on Joel, and I'd ask him, like, who do I talk to about this, you know? And so, I would do the same thing here. I'd find out who you guys have contacts with and who, you know, where's the leverage point. I'm happy to have those conversations and be that advocate. I'm neutral, right? I don't have a dog in the fight in terms of which local organizations get funding or which don't get funding. So I'm in a position to be able to say some of the hard things and have the hard conversations on behalf of the community or on behalf of individual organizations as well, so. Yeah, I like my work, I like my job.
Well, and one thing I think you'll find here compared to what you found in starting, like basically starting up this model in the Gorge is we leverage our partnership as our strength, right? What we lack in resources, what we lack in access, we more than make up for in working together. And I think this is just one group that's an example, like you guys all work together in so many different ways. And I think you'll find that partnership is actually something that is one of our assets.
And that is one of the things when we were sort of comparing and contrasting different communities, when we were looking at where we were gonna get this started, that was one of the things that we realized, like, I get to come into a meeting like this where you're already down the road, you're already partnering, you're already collaborating, you're already coming up with these ideas, right? And so I just get to sit and listen, like, oh, as you guys developed it, I don't have to be the one to convene this conversation, you're already doing that, so we are a few steps ahead than when we started back there. It's fun, I like it.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Really appreciate it. Okay.
Can you include a CV or resume with the minutes when you send the minutes out? Or some,
Yes.
Yeah, I'll make sure you two get connected one way or the other.
okay.
All right, very good. All right, we are now moving on to the last of our items. And that is an update from any of the municipalities or counties on housing projects, housing issues, housing updates. If there's anything to report, any city have anything you want to add at this point in time? Yes.
Well, we, as a city council, selected Related Northwest to do our piece of property that the county gave to us. Thank you very much.
Yes, yes.
So we're working out the agreement with them. We're hoping someday maybe to have them here at my housing task force for the city.
I've invited them to the August meeting, August 28th here.
Okay.
All right, great.
We have, well, actually, Leslie probably should make that announcement. She has something big coming up.
Oh, yeah.
I'm drinking from a fire hose. Yes, we have the grand opening of the Hawkseye Apartments. This is the conversion of the Red Lion in Seaside into a combination of support housing and workforce housing for our partners. And the grand opening is thank God on the 13th of August. But we won't actually really be ready for occupancy probably until the 1st of October. So we won't be accepting applications quite yet. But we had some delays, did the usual things that delay housing projects. So we're really pushing on it right now. But we don't think we have any more obstacles, so we think we're on time. We're on track.
Leslie, that's great news, and it's nice to hear, again, continued progress on those programs. Nice job, and good job, city. Yes.
Well, city, you know.
City's been great. Let me just say that while you're listening, Steve.
You just didn't get in the way.
Yeah, the city, working with the city planning commission and the planning department has been great. They've been really responsive and really helpful, and we are deeply appreciative.
Yeah,
great.
I told them.
Well, thank you. It worked.
We also have, you notice when you all leave town toward the north, you'll see construction happening just past the Dutch Brothers. Actually, just before the Dutch Brothers and after. The project just before is Esperanza Village, being run by CCA. It's underway. I don't know when they'll be done. On the other side of that is Cross Creek. It's 74 units of multifamily housing. I understand there's 24 more apartments going in kind of over that direction, additional housing unit on property that already has one. And then we just announced the purchase of the estuary park. On the other side of the old high school, what that does is put the process back in the hands of the developer for housing across the old high school. So I kind of roughly counted up units, not including Esperanza, we're approaching 300 units of housing. Probably 3 years down the road.
It takes forever, but you're moving it.
We're getting.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is
Planet
awesome.
needs a raise.
Jeff needs a raise. Jeff needs a raise. Jeff needs a staff. Yeah.
People to
Come
help.
on, give the guy some help.
He's doing everything right. All right, that's great news. That's great news. Any other? Yes, Astoria.
Just a little bit, so we've applied for a grant to try and, I'm gonna say rationalize some point as far as right of ways, who owns what, who can do
Yeah.
what, try and identify how to do, where to go and how to do it.
Yeah.
How to fix things out there, because that's the one area that we have some real room for development.
Yeah.
So we're hoping Blue Ridge will be able to start getting that to a point where maybe it opens up for development. And again, it mostly has to do with access and in and out and right of ways there. And hopefully, but we've only applied for the grant. So, and this is the second time we applied for this grant and we didn't get it.
It's a TGM grant, is that right?
I think he's part of that with Colfax.
This is our planner. She knows, yeah, through Colfax, along with Colfax, working on that. So hopefully that moves us a step closer in that regard.
Cool.
And other than that, we're just waiting for, Owens Adair has made a step forward. They've been granted a paving and grading erosion control permit. And we're guessing it's a potential that it might be appealed, but at least it's been granted. So there's another step hopefully forward for that development. Of course, that's senior housing.
Yeah.
Which is really important. We have post 66, which is coming along and 36 of those units are gonna be short-term, but the balance are gonna be long-term apartments. So, that's good.
Yeah, they're leasing up.
Yeah. So, and I
There's-
think that's,
No, there's one more. So Clatsop Behavioral Health applied and has been approved to put together a permanent support housing project on Marine Drive. And I'm racking my brain trying to remember how many units there are. I'm not sure this is the right number, but I think it's 30. And so they've gotten all of their OHDF money. We have supported them financially as well, and they've got their approval, so they're moving ahead.
Right next to the KFC.
Yes, we figure that's a whole new market for them.
Yes. Yeah, that'll keep that going. Any other cities want to add anything? Yes.
I just wanted to mention, and because 4 of us here are on the Cannon Beach Focus Group for housing, we are in the midst of a code rewrite for our updating it with an eye towards doing something to facilitate housing. So far, I can point to 0 units.
But it does take time.
We got units coming on board, just regularly.
Yeah.
But no, Brandon's on there, Chet's on there, Lisa Kerr, Alyssa's been helping us,
I
Marcy.
did want to say thank you.
Yeah, from Herbs Works is our consultant. We had a charrette a couple of weeks ago where there was some 3 days of pretty intense ideas and code discussion and different models and thoughts and processes to see what things people might be willing to consider or what things are just absolutely not going to happen. We regularly have the code update meetings. We have one on Wednesday, and that's gonna be the focus of our upcoming work session is some of the amendments and trying to get some buy-in. So when it eventually gets to Plan Commission and Council, these are things that we're building support for to try to make sure we can get them through when we bring them through the process.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks Brandon for mentioning that, but it's mostly just code updates to look to see what types of things we might be able to encourage.
Okay. Matthew, anything fun, exciting happening in Warrenton?
Yeah, Fort Point continues to kind of treasure the process. They're working on right now their final planned unit development plan. Right now they're doing the land partition. For those who aren't familiar with the numbers, it's 240 or up to 240 multifamily units run by community development partners out of Portland. And then 210, about 60 of them, I think, is what they said for build to rent. And then the rest, market rate, single family housing. So about 450 units. The newest thing happened last night was the commission voted to put the wastewater treatment plant or funding for the wastewater treatment plant on the November ballot. So they were talking last night about kind of an all out, it's gonna be, an option to the voters, but that, certainly if we don't build a new wastewater treatment plant, if we don't start now, we won't ever get the 450 units.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they were talking about at kind of information sessions and that kind of thing. So certainly the commission is sensitive to the challenges that we're having with the wastewater treatment plant. And then we continue to work on certifying our dikes and levees to reduce the impact of risk 2.0 and limit the scope of the ESA stuff in the city. So we're working through all of the stuff, but we've got very small kind of infill developments that have been coming through.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
those have been fun, triplexes and fourplexes. We have a nice little 9-unit apartment complex on a vacant piece of property. So certainly some conversations internally to the city of, they're blocking my view, but
None of the rest of the cities have ever dealt with their blocking. Ever.
No, I'm sure.
All right, great. Gail? Yes.
So, you could talk about this as easily as I could, but the county is working through its clear and objective standards workload, which we have to get adopted by July 1st of next year. So we've just really been going line by line through our code, looking at anything related to housing and trying to clarify and make things objective. Also, our public comment period on our voluntary amendments to the code to increase housing production at all price points. That public comment period closed on July 21st. The board will be having a work session on that on August 7th. And I think those are the big things. And like Matthew over in Warrenton, we're all dealing with the potential fallout of how the BIOP is going to affect us. And also, just for those of you who may not know, there are also some new changes at the federal level related to HUD and FHA loans. And so their floodplain development requirements are actually increasing above and beyond what our current codes are. So you just want to keep that in mind as you're working with people at the counter. Thanks.
To build another foot higher, something like that. Yeah.
Yep. Two foot. Yeah.
And I'm going to add something on the economic opportunities analysis. One of my big tasks is to work through a economic development planning process for the county. And we've really identified the big three. Everyone knows the big three: forest, fisheries, and fun, recreation. I was trying to make it an alliteration. I like it. Forest, fisheries, and fun, right? Okay. So those three have always been there, but we've always said since 1981, we should diversify. We should do something. We should diversify. They said it in 81, they said it in 95, they said it in 2004, they said it in 2014. And yet here we are in 2024 saying, hey, we've got these three great industries, which are not bad. Don't get me wrong, they're great industries. But we need to find something and actually do something to move us into the next economy. And so what we're really focused on right now are three industry sectors. One of them is healthcare. We are blessed to have two healthcare systems serving our community, and we have a lot of ancillary services that go along with those things that are critically important. And as we age, that's going to continue. All right. The second one we're looking at is construction. Training construction, keeping construction workers, and actually building housing. Guess where that comes from? And so that's one of the other things. There's also a part of that is also timber related because we make a lot of lumber here. So I mean, those that are really tied as well. And the third one we're looking at is what we're calling the marine economy. The blue economy is the trendy term, but I like the term marine because we have both the ocean and the river. We have a fun coast and we have a working coast. And so, but we have so many pieces of how we can better use that blue/marine economy. We have Clatsop Community College, which has very specific training facilities and programs at MERTS. We have the Oregon State University Food Research Center in Astoria. And we have the Port of Astoria. We've got lots of pieces for that economy to actually reinvigorate itself, reinvent itself. We can't go back to the 1920s and do it the way we did. We have to move to the next generation of marine economies, and that is research, technology, and innovation. And so I met with the port, I met with Oregon State University, I'm meeting with Oregon State University again next week. We're trying to lift up a research-oriented innovation center for the community. And so that would mean starting at the schools, working to the community college, working to Oregon State University, and all of the businesses that we have here. The model's being done in San Diego, Los Angeles, and Seattle. We can have a Clatsop County sized version of that. So that's my elevator speech, and I have to stop being the motivator. So, but anyway, those are the three things that we're hoping to lift up. All three of them are tied to having housing. We can't do economic development unless we have the right level of housing. So this committee, along with the other committee, we all are moving in the same direction, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So anyone else have anything for the good of the order? Because we're gonna finish at 3 o'clock guaranteed. Yes.
So I just wanted to make everybody aware, we've got these meetings scheduled through October.
All right.
The plan, I'm just gonna jump in and say this.
Sure.
So the planning group has agendas. So we're gonna meet every month until October, and then we'll take our traditional 2 months off and come back in January. So I just wanted to let everybody know, like, you can put these on their schedules.
Okay.
We're planning to, we've got a long list of things that we wanna talk about over the next month.
But you're free for the holidays.
Yes.
But you're free for the holidays, right. Well, we will not make you come on things,
Yeah.
the day before Thanksgiving.
All right. Perfect. Anything else for the good of the order? Anything from up top? Nope. You guys have been joyful there. Thank you. I really appreciate all your participation. All right. I move we adjourn. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.